Anna here, and today I wanted to share with you the books that I read in July. Hold on, my dog wants in. Come on, buddy. Sorry, okay, so this is my July reading wrap up, and let's just get into it. Let's talk about the books that I read. I don't know how many I read, I haven't counted yet. Let's start. I read this many. Okay, so the very first book that I read this month was Dead of Winter by Darcy Coates. This book I read when I stayed in a cabin, and it's about these group of people that go into the woods and get picked off one by one. And so it's like a whodunit, trying to figure out who killed them all. It's a pretty fun story, I'm not gonna lie. It's pretty different from most of the other Darcy Coates books I've read for a few reasons. One, I would say that although there are tons of horror elements in here, it does have a lot of thriller and mystery mixed in too, which a lot of her books I feel like aren't as thriller mystery as this guy is. It's also pretty different because of how dark and unhappy everything is. Darcy Coates books are usually like everyone lives or most people live and everything turns out okay. This book wasn't really like that, and so it was definitely on the darker side of the Darcy Coates spectrum. And then the other thing that I'll say about it is that it's extremely well written. Like it was such a good book to read. And I think I mentioned this book before, but I said that it's so cool seeing where a writer started and where they ended up. I think that this is one of her most well-written, thorough books. The only thing that I will say is that the whodunit aspect, completely, oh, I just punched myself in the face, completely obvious. But that is how I feel about most thrillers. I feel like if you set it up or you say certain things, it's just way too obvious. I feel like I knew who the killer was in the first like 20-30 pages of the book, but it still didn't ruin the read for me. Usually once you figure it out, you're like, why am I even reading this? But it was still an interesting book and I still loved every second. You see the perspective of one character, and so you're seeing her work through everything, trying to figure out, you know, who done it. And so that was still interesting to read, even though the who done it was, I think, fairly obvious. I don't think that it's going to be a big surprise to anybody. So yeah, that's how I feel about that guy. The next book that I read was Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club. I read a few books that I had read before because I did that video. Oh, sorry, I'm so tired today. I have not been sleeping well this week. I did the video, the best books I ever read, like the only books I've ever given 5 stars to. And so I wanted to reread a few books to make sure that they were actually perfect 5-star reads. Ones that were on my list that it had been a while since I read, just to make sure that they actually did make the list. So anyways, I read Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. This is one of my favorite books ever written. It really is a genius book. I have an entire video, so I can leave that linked down below, or you know, just go back a few videos. I just posted it maybe a week or two ago. But it's about a man who lives a pretty traditional life. He goes to work, he travels for work, he comes home, he meets a man named Tyler Durden who kind of flips his entire world upside down, teaches him new mottos and rules to live by, and he ends up a very different character than how he began in the story. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful book. There's not much else to say about that because I think all I said was in that video. The next book that I read was Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, A Savage Journey to the Heart of the American Dreams. I've read this one plenty of times before, but this was one that I knew was high up on my list, but I wasn't sure if it made the final cut, which it didn't. I don't think it's a 5-star book to me. There are a few things in here that I just couldn't. It knocked off a few things, but it's still a fantastic book. It is so fun to read. If you haven't read Fear and Loathing, I mean, you gotta do it. It's so great. And if you've seen the movie and you haven't read the book, highly recommend. Maybe I'll do a movie first book on this, but it's about 2 men going to Las Vegas and just causing mayhem, doing drugs and lying and getting into all sorts of weird things. I think it was written in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. It was written in 71, so it is an older book, but I just love Hunter S. Thompson's writing. He invented this gonzo way of writing, which is a mixture of autobiographical, but then also like a journalistic approach as well, which I know those things seem independent of each other and it seems like they wouldn't mix because journalistic is just the facts and autobiographical is more emotional and brings, you know, personal opinion into it. But he has such an interesting way of combining the two and creating a story that it feels almost like you're reading an article, but then there's just a whole bunch of mayhem added into it. It's such an interesting way of writing, so I highly recommend his books. I've read quite a few of his other ones too. The Hells Angels book, where he went and actually lived with the Hells Angels, is super interesting too, so highly recommend him if you're looking for just kind of like a weird ride, honestly. The next one that I read was The Stranger by Albert Camus. I never know how to pronounce it. This one I talked about in that video, that 5-star video as well. This is one of my favorite books ever written. And I think I read it for the first time only a few years ago, and it just blew me away. It was such a good book. And so I picked it up again because I wanted to make sure it was a 5-star read. It was to me. It's such an interesting book and one of the most interesting narrators of a book that I've ever read. It's about a man. He just doesn't really care about anything. He's just complacent with everything. He just doesn't care. His boss asks him if he wants to move to Paris. He's like, meh. His girlfriend asks if he wants to get married. He's like, meh. His mom dies. He's like, meh. Like, just nothing matters. And so he ends up accidentally murdering somebody and put on trial for the murder and just has no remorse for what he's done. And the ending is so nihilistic. The whole book is pretty nihilistic, but it's just very interesting if you want something to deeply analyze. Even at his mom's funeral, he's just complaining about how hot it is and the sun, and the only emotions related around that day are toward the weather and not towards the death of his mom. It's just, from beginning to end, so much in here. I believe Albert Camus was a philosopher, so it is like definitely a deeper book, and there's a lot of meaning in here, and it's quite nihilistic, and it's just an interesting read, and I love rereading it and just trying to figure out the perspective of that character, because he's one that I can't really connect with, you know? The next one I read was Stephen King's The Institute. I bought this and read this for the purpose of a different video, but I read it, so I'm going to share it in this video too. I also was interested in reading it because it had such a high rating on Goodreads. It's like 4.2 or 4.3 or something. It's a high rating. It's one of his highest rated books. Not the highest, but it's like, I would say top 5, I think. And so I was excited to pick it up. I got to the point where it said psychic kids, and I was like, no. So it's about kids that get abducted and put in this institute, and some of them are telekinetic and some of them are telepathic. Yeah, and then so it's just kind of like their whole struggle getting abducted in this institute. Don't get me wrong, it's an interesting read, and it is pretty heartbreaking seeing the things that happen to children in this book, but it's one of those Stephen King books where I'm like, did this have to be 700 pages? And I don't know that it did. And I'm all for long books. If it keeps my attention and I'm entertained the whole time, I have no problem reading a 1,000-page book. But I think just because this subject wasn't for me, it felt like it dragged on a little bit. I didn't particularly fall in love with any characters. You know what, here's the thing. It's honestly just not any problem with the way that it was written, but it's just how I feel about supernatural stuff. Sometimes I'm super into it, and sometimes I don't want anything to do with it. And when it comes to Stephen King's supernatural, I mean, telekinetic, telepathic kids, you're like, okay, I've already read that, right? I've read The Shining, I've read Carrie, I've read, you know, Dr. Sleep. I've read so many of these books that when it came to that, I was like, darn, you know, and there's obviously other telepathic or telekinetic characters in other stories too. So I don't know, it just wasn't a book for me. Let me know if you guys have read this, because I'm interested to see your opinion on it and why people love it so much and why it has such a high rating. It wasn't bad, it just wasn't a book that was for me. I honestly went into it thinking it was something completely different, and I didn't read the back or anything, so like I said, I bought it for a completely different video. So I just went into it not knowing what it was about. And then, yeah, once I learned, I was like, I should have known that wasn't going to be a book that I would love, but that's okay. The next book that I read, my friends, is the best vampire book I have read in my entire life. In my life. This is my favorite vampire book I've ever read. Speaking of supernatural stuff, because I've read a lot of vampire books that they were fine, you know, but it's just hard to get me interested. But this book is called Carmilla. It predates Dracula by 2 decades, and I was interested to read it. I picked it up. It says that it was the inspiration behind Dracula, but I don't know if it means that directly it was an inspiration or that it was one of the first vampire books ever written and therefore was an inspiration for the subsequent books. I'm not sure, but this book is so good. It's by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. I'm gonna Google how to pronounce this because I'm gonna mess it up. I think it's Le Fanu. This book is so atmospheric. It's so creepy. It's one of those monster books that it's not super detailed, you know, it's fairly light. It was published, I think, in 1871. It's an old book. It's about this family who lives in a mansion, and they meet these other people who are traveling. They have a spill, their like carriage falls over, and a little girl is hurt, and her mom's freaking out saying, I have to get somewhere and I don't know what to do with her because I can't bring her with me now. And because the little girl, the other younger girl who was there, is kind of secluded from society, and she was supposed to have another friend come and stay with her, but that friend ended up dying. So her dad felt really bad for her, and she's like, please dad, can we have this random girl stay? Like, I'm in need of kids to hang out with. And her dad offers the woman, that young girl, to stay. Her name is Carmilla, you guessed it. And the story progresses from there. Weird things keep happening in the town. People are dying, young girls are dying all around, falling into strange fits, saying that people have visited it in the night. The main girl in the story, I can't remember her name now, even though I just read this book. The main girl in the story ends up falling ill, and they end up, I'm not gonna give the whole thing away, but I gotta tell you, it's so atmospheric, and I'm going to be doing a whole other video on this. People also call this a lesbian vampire story, so, you know, keep that in mind. It's also interesting for a book that was written in the 1800s. I'll go into more detail in this in a future video. Actually, I think it'll be the next video that I post, so keep an eye out for that. But as far as reading goes, that was one of the best books that I read this year, and my favorite vampire story I've ever read. And I also read one other thing this month too, which I'm not going to talk about. I'll talk about in that video. I just don't want to completely ruin that video, so that'll be out next. But the last book that I read was Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This is my first Riley Sager book ever, and I have seen them everywhere and people talk about them, and then I looked them up on Goodreads, and some of them are like, have like a 3.678 rating, and I'm like, I don't know. And so I decided to just pick one up and see for myself what it was like. And it's about a girl who gets an opportunity to basically house sit in this beautiful, rich apartment building. I think it's in Manhattan, and she's just, you know, blown away by her luck because she's had a pretty rough upbringing. She was raised pretty poor, and both of her parents had since passed away, so she feels kind of like lonely and out of touch with the world. And I gotta tell ya, I connected a lot with this character. You know, as somebody who was raised without a lot of money, and you know, both of my parents have passed away too, a lot of the stuff that she said in this book like really hit me. And so yeah, I connected with this character. I liked this book a lot because of that. It's a story where she's staying and trying to figure out if things are strange and if it's too good to be true, or if she's just like overthinking things. I don't want to give too much away. I would say that it's a slow book, but a lot of thrillers are. And it was one of those where some stuff I figured out, but I didn't figure out everything in the first few pages. So if a thriller book can keep me entertained and I didn't guess everything by the end, I say it's a pretty good thriller book. So I liked this one. I enjoyed it. Let me know if there are other Riley Sager books that you guys have read that you enjoy as well. But otherwise, I connected with the character on that one, and yeah, it was a fun ride to go on. It wasn't anything too crazy. The writing was really good though, and it kept me entertained, and I feel like everything was there for a reason and came and wrapped back around, and there were even some things that you could analyze within the chapters, which I thought was pretty entertaining too. As far as that one goes, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. Those are the books that I read this month. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what you guys have read, and I will see you soon with another horror video. Bye guys. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh my god, I'm never gonna be able to talk about it.